Remnants of Filth, Chapter 2, by Meat Bun Doesn't Eat Meat. Recording by Direwolf Studios. Chapter 2, Gumong Bears It All. Not long after Mo Shi received the secret missive from the capital, the Emperor of Changhua finally announced the news of Gumong's return, along with how he should be punished. Wang Shujun would be granted complete control over him. The news spread like wildfire across all of Changhua. Although Mo Shi's army was stationed all the way on the northern frontier, they nevertheless found out a mere 3 days later. The northern frontier army exploded. On the surface, they were as solemn and calm as ever. But during breaks between patrols, almost everyone started to weigh in. Mo Shi saw it all, and for once, he didn't stop them. He thought it perfectly normal that these soldiers would feel dissatisfied. After all, the Northern Frontier Army had once been the invincible army of Gu. A healthy majority of the soldiers had once risked their lives alongside Gumong. Their feelings about him were extremely complicated. Though their loyalties remained unquestioned, they had once wholeheartedly sworn allegiance to their commander, Gumong, even though that same Gumong had once dubbed them the Wangba Army. Seriously, that wasn't a joke. Wangba as in tortoise, and Wangba as in bastard. Before Mo Shi took over, this army's roster had read like this: Liu Dazuang, soldier of the Wangba Army. Zhang Daiyan, squad leader of the Wangba Army. And so on and so forth. Bastards all the way down the line. First on the list had been Gumong, commander of the Wangba Army. Logically speaking, no one would want to enlist in an army with such a vulgar name, but that concern hadn't borne out. At the time, Gumong had been the most illustrious general of Changhua. Most of the well-known generals were constrained by their own challenges, obligations, and pretensions, but Gumong was different. He was slave-born. He had no father or mother, no worries or cares, no ego to lose, nor any fear of death. If all of Chenghua's noble young masters took off their clothes and stood in a row, Gumong might have not been the most muscular, but he definitely would have had the most scars. He had fully deserved the title of Chenghua's Beast of the Altar. In those days, Gumong's deputy had always reprimanded him at the sight of his wounds. "You're the commander. Why do you always run to the front? Don't you know how to dodge?" Gumong would smile. His dark eyes were very bright, and his lips looked very soft. His voice was naturally smooth as silk, and he cheerfully mollified his angry friend. "My legs are too long. I have no choice but to run fast. No choice at all." His very presence seemed to bring laughter and sweetness to the battlefield, as though such places could be more than freezing cold and crimson blood. He remembered every one of his comrades' birthdays, and between battles he often took the cultivators from his camp to make merry and drink wine in some little village. Sometimes they'd be met with crafty villagers who charged sky-high prices. But General Gu never got angry. He merely laughed and tossed all his money on the table in order to buy his soldiers wine and meat. In the end, he'd yell, "Eat up, drink up. You'd better all stuff your faces and eat your fill. You're my precious darlings. There's not enough money? I'll pay in other ways." Gumong was a man of his word. He traded fur coats for wine and spirit jades for meat, and once even took off all his military robes and armor and tossed them on the bar in exchange for Nui Hong rice wine, at which point the army thugs started laughing and heckling him. "General Gu, we want beef too. Do you have anything else you could take off?" By then, he'd already stripped down to a single snow-white robe, but he still laughed and pointed at them. "Just you wait." "No way! General Gu, you wouldn't really take off your underwear too?" "That can't be worth very much." Gumong didn't plan to take off his underwear, but it was true that he didn't have anything left. He bit his lip and thought, and before everyone's amused and shocked expressions, he scooched up to the pretty, widowed proprietress and planted a kiss on her cheek. The soldiers all stopped talking and stared. Even the widow was stunned speechless, drops of wine plinking off her ladle. It took her a moment to snap back to her senses and start chasing after Gumong, ladle held aloft. "Shameless! You awful flirt!" Everyone roared with laughter. Amid the thigh-slapping and sympathetic wincing, the widow chased Gumong around the entire room. I'm serious! Gumong cried, begging for mercy as he ran. You're beautiful! I know I'm beautiful! You're not bad-looking either, young man! But you're way too fucking shameless. Couldn't you sneak out here alone and kiss me at night? Why'd you have to do it in front of so many people? Pervert! This pervert ran around in utter chaos, yet he made sure to shamelessly shout, Yes, I'll come over tomorrow night, or I can stay here tonight, as long as you give us another 2 caddies of beef. Please, dear miss. Pah! You've already asked me for beef on credit 3 times since you've been stationed here, and this is the 4th. Every single time you say you'll come over tomorrow night. Do you think I'm gonna fall for your tricks? The widow yelled back, her little fist punching the wooden bar so hard it cracked. The army ruffians were laughing so hard they were about to fall over. No matter how indignantly the widow spoke, in the end, Gumong was still able to use his pretty face and the promise of coming over tomorrow to secure another 2 caddies of marinated beef for his brothers. General Gu, you sure know how to win people over. Of course I do, Gumong said smugly, preening with delight. I've gone through thousands of beautiful flowers. Everyone knows of my exploits. With a commander like that, it was no wonder a youth in those days grandly declared, Who cares if they're called the Wangba Army? Even if they were the Jiba Army, I'd enlist in the Cock Army for General Gu. His friend standing next to him turned up his nose. Ay-ya, you read your classics in vain. I see. How vulgar. How would you make it elegant? If you were going to go with the Jiba Army, why not call it the Jiba Army? Jiba as in cease battle. What a good name! The youth exclaimed in admiration. I like it. No way, I just made that up. Who would like a name like Jiba? Wouldn't you find it embarrassing? Go ahead and try it if you don't believe me. Even a dog would get mad at you if you called it that. The youth laughed. Never say never. Just because something doesn't exist now doesn't mean it won't in the future. If even an imperial army can be named Wangba, I don't think it's impossible that something else might be called Jiba in the future. Fortunately, Gumong didn't hear this discussion. Otherwise, he might have slapped the table with a triumphant yell and changed his title to Gumong, commander of the Jiba army, thereby making all his subordinates suffer alongside him. Amid the cruelty of war, only a little madman like Gumong would be inspired to joke around. In addition to dubbing his troops the Wangba army, he also personally crafted their flag, creatively cutting a tortoise out of a jade green banner, complete with a realistic little tail. He cast a spell on the flag, and with every incense time that had passed, the tortoise roared, Wangba! Wangba! Chongha's pride! A mighty name known far and wide! In short, it was extremely embarrassing. The first time Gumong rode out to battle with this flag, the enemy general nearly laughed himself into an early grave. Nonetheless, before the day was out, Gumong's Wangba army had reduced 100,000 strong opposing army to a sobbing mess. Gumong fought many more battles after that one, both large and small, and came away victorious every time. As a result, during the years that Gumong was a general, the enemies of Changhua would pale at the glimpse of the tortoise tail. The sight they dreaded most was, perhaps, that of a little tortoise flag raised up over the smoke of the battlefield as General Gu rode out, cleared his throat, and introduced himself with absolute seriousness. "This humble one is Gumang, general of the Wangba army. I'm here to learn from your honorable selves." Failing to defeat this young cultivator was shameful enough. Even worse was having to snivel through one's report to one's emperor. "Wah, this subordinate is truly incompetent and failed to defeat the Wangba army." It was the stuff of nightmares. As for Chonghua's soldiers, although Gumang was outrageous and mischievous, his charisma was unsurpassed. Many people revered him in those days, and some even took his nonsense "shitty names keep you safe" mantra as gospel. In accordance with the trend, many babies born during that time had the misfortune of being given shitty names. Chu, strong root, Gen Zhuang. Shui, iron pillar, Te Zhu. Jiang, aching balls, Dan Tong. When Mo Shi took over the Wangba army, the first thing he did was change its ridiculous name. He would never allow for his entry on the military roster to become Mo Shi, General of the Wangba Army. Absolutely not. And so, the Wangba Army was renamed the Northern Frontier Army and reassigned to Mo Shi's command. The dark humor that had stood up to spilled blood and the smoke of war crumbled away, much like Gumang's glorious reputation. Those little tortoises that had shouted and yelled, "Wangba, Wangba, Changhua's pride, a mighty name known far and wide," were like an absurd and fleeting joke. They were never seen on the vast battlefields again. The army's existence became a solemn one. There were no more flowers or nectar, no one who would strive to memorize any of the lowly soldiers' names, no one to take the men out to make merry, no one to buy them cheap wine with the clothes off his back. Battle regained its absolute and pitiless severity. An eternal winter had arrived. Although most of the Northern Frontier's army hated Gumang nowadays, perhaps that past was the reason they couldn't quite feel the same way ordinary civilians did when they spoke of him. This was especially true of those old soldiers who'd fought in the Wangba army with General Gu. Every time they said his name, a hint of something unreadable rose in their eyes. I really didn't expect him to end up like this. Everyone knows Wang Shujun's cruelty. I'm afraid it's an awful sign that His Imperial Majesty is letting Wang Shujun deal with him. He's definitely going to die a horrible death. A man of ambition wasn't necessarily disliked, but a traitor was certain to be universally reviled. Only when these veterans of the Wangba army gathered did they murmur about things that had nothing to do with hatred. As the night wore on, some of the ones who were getting on in their years finally lost all enthusiasm. What a good man he was. If only certain things hadn't gone the way they had, then he wouldn't have... Shh! Be quiet! The nerve to mention such things! Do you want to die? The old soldier shook himself out of his reverie with a yelp. As he realized what he nearly let slip out, the drunken sparkle in his eyes vanished, and he couldn't help but shudder. The other soldiers continued chiding him. Now we're working under General Mo, and Gumang is the person he hates most in the world. It's not as if you don't know his temper. If he heard you, none of us would live to see the morning. You're right, silly me, getting confused as soon as I start drinking. The soldiers sitting around the fire pit fell silent and stared blankly into the flames, each one of them lost in their own thoughts. After a long time, someone else sighed and said, "But everyone changes, I suppose. All we can say is that this is General Gu's fate." "How many years has it been? Why are you all still calling him General Gu?" "Oh, right. I meant Gumang." It was still night at the frontier fortress. The bonfire crackled, bursting with a stream of golden sparks more dazzling than the stars. The tipsy old soldier lay on the ground with his head pillowed on his arms. He gazed up at the starry sky and the twinkling Z-Way star, the jut of his throat bobbing as he muttered a few words no one else could hear. To be honest, it was only because of Gumang that I enlisted. I once even drank with him around the fire. He didn't put on any airs either. Back then, as I watched him laugh, I thought, if one day I could die for him in battle, it would be a good way to go. Who could have known he would end up meeting such a fate? Gone are the birds, discarded lies the bow. After making use of Gumang, the enemy nation was offering him as a part of a gift of peace and giving him back to Chonghua. This man had lived through many turns of fortune and had seen much of the world's beauty, but a single wrong move had left him a traitor. What was done was done. There was no going back. Was this what it was meant, to reap what you sow? To be an architect of your own destruction? Returning to the topic at hand, although Gumang had come into a cruel fate, he had only himself to blame. It satisfied the people to see him unwanted by either side. For a while, almost everyone in Chonghua eagerly awaited Gumang's end. Whether he was to be beheaded, given death by 1,000 cuts, boiled alive, hacked to pieces, or drawn and quartered, even a little girl who had just learned to speak could lisp sycophantly after the adults. "We can't go easy on that disgraceful pighead." Thus, Gumang, General Gu, Chonghua's former heroic commander, Moshi's arch-enemy, the legendary man who had once been praised as the beast of the altar, had so pathetically become a disgraceful pighead.